There was something enchanting about the old carnival that had come to town. It popped up overnight, just as they always do, with bright lights flickering and laughter echoing through the streets. I had seen the posters plastered around town, each promising a night of fun and excitement. But there was one attraction that drew me in like a moth to a flame: the carousel. It was located at the back of the fairgrounds, surrounded by tents and stalls bustling with activity. The carousel was unlike any I had ever seen. While others spun with vibrant colors and cheerful music, this one stood still at the center, shrouded in an air of mystery. Its horses were painted in muted tones, their expressions hauntingly lifelike, as if they had been trapped in a moment of eternal joy. They were adorned with intricate details, manes flowing gracefully, eyes sparkling, yet a heaviness lingered in the depths of their gaze. I approached, captivated by the carousel's stillness. The air around it felt electric, charged with a peculiar energy that set my heart racing. I could hear the faint sound of a music box playing a gentle melody, sweet and haunting. The notes danced in the cool evening breeze, tugging at my memories like an old lullaby. As I stepped closer, I noticed an inscription on the side of the carousel: "Ride and remember." A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just part of the charm. I couldn't resist. I had to ride it. I climbed onto one of the horses, feeling the cold, smooth surface beneath me. The carousel creaked as if awakening from a long slumber, the music growing slightly louder, wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. With a gentle lurch, the carousel began to spin, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The world outside blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors and lights, the carnival fading into obscurity as I lost myself in the ride. As I turned round and round, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter from the fairgrounds became muffled, fading away until only the haunting melody remained. With each revolution, I felt a strange sensation. Memories began to flood my mind, fleeting images of my childhood. Carefree days spent with friends, the warmth of summer evenings, and laughter that echoed like the music around me. It was intoxicating, yet unsettling. I had not realized how desperately I craved those moments, how much I missed the innocence of youth. But as the carousel continued to spin, those memories grew sharper, more vivid, until they became overwhelming. I could almost feel the sun on my skin, the thrill of the wind rushing through my hair. The faces of friends long gone flickered before my eyes, their laughter mingling with the melody. I tried to hold on to each memory, but they began to dissolve into shadows, slipping away like grains of sand through my fingers. Panic set in as the carousel accelerated, spinning faster and faster, my heart racing in tandem. The music twisted into a dissonant cacophony, the once soothing notes morphing into a frantic wail. I looked around, and the other riders began to take shape, familiar faces morphing into distorted reflections of themselves. Each person wore an expression of longing, their eyes filled with desperation, as if they too were clinging to the memories that swirled around us. With a sudden jolt, the carousel came to a halt. I was thrown forward, struggling to regain my balance. The music faded to a whisper. The vibrant colors muted to shades of gray. I looked around, confusion washing over me. The carousel had transformed. Where there had once been laughter and joy, a heavy silence now enveloped us. The horses remained still, their eyes still shimmering with an unsettling intelligence. I glanced at the other riders. They appeared frozen in place, their expressions locked in a moment of despair. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the realization sank in. I was not simply a visitor to this carousel. I was part of something far more sinister. The inscription I had seen earlier now burned in my mind: "Ride and remember." The memories I had once cherished were no longer mine to hold. The carousel was not a vessel of nostalgia, but a trap, feeding on the essence of those who dared to ride. The ground beneath me began to tremble, the carousel's once festive atmosphere transforming into something darker. The air felt thick with an impending doom, the shadows deepening around the edges of the tent. I tried to get off the horse, but it felt as if I were glued to it, unable to move. The music started to play again, but this time it was different. Each note was sharp, cutting through the silence like glass. Suddenly the carousel lurched and I felt a pull, as if it were dragging me into its depths. I clung to the horse, heart racing, desperate to escape. The other riders were fading, their features blurring into nothingness, consumed by the carousel's insatiable hunger. I struggled against the invisible force, but it was no use. Just when I thought I would be lost forever, the music hit a high note, and I felt a surge of energy wash over me. In an instant I was flung from the horse and stumbled to the ground. The carousel continued to spin faster and faster, a whirlwind of colors and shadows. I crawled away, my heart pounding, the fear coursing through me like electricity. The laughter and joy I had once sought were replaced by a chilling emptiness. I managed to reach the edge of the tent, collapsing against the pole as I gasped for breath. Looking back, the carousel was still spinning, the haunting melody echoing through the night. The figures on the horses were now indistinct shapes, trapped in an eternal cycle, their faces locked in expressions of sorrow. I knew then that I had narrowly escaped its grasp, but the memories I had hoped to reclaim were lost to me forever. As I stumbled away from the carnival, I couldn't shake the feeling that the carousel had imprinted itself on my soul. I had been drawn in by its allure, seduced by the promise of nostalgia, only to find myself caught in a web of despair. The laughter of the carnival faded behind me, but the echo of the carousel's music lingered, a haunting reminder of the ride that never stops. It was just a regular Saturday when I found the ticket. I was at the local flea market browsing through stacks of dusty books and knickknacks that had once belonged to someone else. The market was a maze of tables, each piled high with forgotten treasures, and I enjoyed the thrill of searching for something unexpected among the clutter. As I rifled through a box filled with old photographs, my fingers brushed against a crumpled piece of paper. Pulling it out, I realized it was a ticket, faded and worn, its edges ragged from age. The printing was barely legible, but I could make out a few words: Circus Extravaganza and Tonight Only. Below that was a large, colorful design that depicted a grand circus tent, surrounded by dancing clowns and acrobats. Excitement washed over me as I examined the ticket. I hadn't heard anything about a circus coming to town, but I was immediately intrigued. The date on the ticket was today's date. I glanced around the flea market, half expecting someone to claim it, but nobody seemed to pay it any attention. I pocketed it, a rush of anticipation coursing through me. That evening, I set out to find the circus. I followed the directions scribbled on the back of the ticket, my heart racing as I ventured into an unfamiliar part of town. The streets grew narrower, the buildings taller, casting shadows that danced across the pavement. I felt as though I were being drawn into another world, a place far removed from the mundane reality I knew. Eventually, I arrived at a vacant lot. A massive red and white striped tent loomed in the center, illuminated by a string of bright lights that flickered against the encroaching dusk. The scene was almost surreal. It felt as though I had stumbled into a painting. I could hear the distant sounds of laughter, the rustle of fabric, and the faint music of a calliope beckoning me closer. I approached the entrance, excitement bubbling within me. The ticket felt warm in my pocket, almost alive. As I reached for it, a wave of hesitation washed over me. I glanced around, taking in the other guests. They were dressed in their finest, their faces painted with joy and anticipation, but something felt off, an unease that clung to the edges of my thoughts. When I reached the entrance, I handed over my ticket to the woman at the gate. She was dressed in a colorful costume adorned with sequins and feathers, her face painted with an exaggerated smile. She took the ticket, her expression shifting ever so slightly as she examined it. For a fleeting moment, her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. But then she smiled again and waved me through. As I stepped into the tent, I was enveloped by an intoxicating blend of scents: popcorn, cotton candy, and something sweetly pungent that I couldn't quite place. The atmosphere was electric, vibrant, alive. I took a seat in the audience, anticipation surging through me as I waited for the show to begin. The lights dimmed and the crowd erupted into applause. A hush fell over the audience as the ringmaster stepped into the spotlight, a tall figure dressed in a crimson coat and top hat. His voice boomed across the tent, welcoming us to the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The show began, a whirlwind of acrobats soaring through the air, clowns tumbling across the stage, and exotic animals parading before us. At first, I was mesmerized, completely absorbed in the spectacle. But as the night wore on, I noticed subtle shifts. The clowns' laughter seemed hollow, the performers' movements too precise, their smiles too wide. There was a surreal quality to it all, as if I were watching something that wasn't entirely real. I leaned forward in my seat, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Suddenly, my gaze was drawn to the performers on the edge of the ring. They began to gather, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting toward the audience. It felt as if they were discussing something important, something hidden from view. Then one of the clowns stepped forward, the same one who had taken my ticket. His smile faltered for a moment as he scanned the audience, and my heart dropped when his gaze landed on me. There was an intensity in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine, and in that instant I knew something was wrong. I glanced down at my ticket, a fresh wave of unease washing over me. The ink on it appeared to shift under the light, the letters seeming to change shape and color. Panic rose in my chest and I stood up, ready to leave, but the ringmaster's voice echoed through the tent, commanding the audience's attention. "Welcome to the final act," he boomed, and a hush fell over the crowd. My heart raced as I watched the performers line up, their faces painted with expressions that felt anything but joyful. The music swelled, and the atmosphere shifted from exhilarating to oppressive, as if the very fabric of the tent were closing in around me. The clown I had seen earlier was now staring directly at me, his painted smile twisting into something darker. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the audience was enraptured, oblivious to the shifting energy around them. I felt trapped, caught in an invisible web that tightened with each passing moment. The performers began to move closer to me, their eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to escape. I turned and rushed toward the exit, but the tent seemed to stretch endlessly, the entrance receding farther away with every step. I pushed through the crowd, the laughter and applause fading into a distant memory. Just as I reached the entrance, a hand gripped my shoulder, pulling me back. I turned to see the same clown, his painted face mere inches from mine. There was no laughter in his eyes now, only a deep, unsettling emptiness. He gestured toward the stage with a swift motion, and I felt a sense of dread settle in my stomach. I managed to break free and stumbled out of the tent into the cool night air, gasping for breath. The sounds of the circus faded behind me, replaced by the unsettling silence of the empty lot. I turned back, ready to flee, but the tent was gone, replaced by a barren patch of grass illuminated by the moonlight. I looked down at the ticket in my hand, now completely blank, as if it had never existed. In that moment, I realized the truth. I hadn't found the ticket. It had found me. The circus was never meant for me, yet I had been drawn into its clutches. A thrill-seeker, perhaps, but I had unknowingly become part of the show, an audience member caught in a performance that defied the boundaries of reality. As I walked away from the spot where the circus had been, the memory of those haunting eyes followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I would never truly escape the magic of the night. It started with an old flyer tucked into the bottom of a drawer I hadn't opened in years. I wasn't even sure how it ended up there. The paper was yellowed and brittle, the edges curling with age. The image on it was faded, but I could still make out the large, bold letters. "The Amazing Bellini, one night only. Don't miss the greatest performance of your life." Below the headline was an illustration of a man in an extravagant circus costume, his arms outstretched, top hat tilted at a jaunty angle, and a wide grin plastered across his face. I stared at it for a while, trying to remember if I had ever gone to a show like that, or how I could have ended up with this flyer in my possession. The address on the flyer was for an old theater on the edge of town, one that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. No one ever talked about the place, and it was mostly forgotten, blending into the backdrop of the quiet town. I figured it was just one of those relics of the past, a piece of history that nobody cared about anymore. Still, something about the flyer nagged at me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I needed to see that old theater. Maybe it was just curiosity, or maybe it was the sense that something had been lost, forgotten by time. The next weekend, I found myself standing in front of the crumbling building. The theater was more decayed than I expected, its once grand facade now a weathered husk, the windows boarded up, and the marquee long since shattered. The place felt out of sync with the rest of the town, like it had been abandoned not just by people, but by time itself. I walked around the back, hoping to find a way in. The doors were locked, but one of the side windows had been broken open, leaving enough space for me to squeeze through. I hesitated for a moment before climbing inside, landing in what looked like the back hallway. Dust clung to every surface, and the air smelled of mildew and old wood. The theater was completely dark, the only light coming from the faint slivers of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I made my way toward the main auditorium. It was just as decayed as the outside, rows of rotting seats, the stage partially collapsed, and the ceiling crumbling away. The place looked like it hadn't seen life in decades, but as I stood there, staring at the faded grandeur of the old building, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, like I had been here before. As I scanned the room, my eyes were drawn to something on the stage. At first, I thought it was just a pile of old props or forgotten equipment, but as I moved closer, I saw it was a trunk, a large, ornate chest, the kind you'd expect to see in an old magician's act. Its surface was worn, the brass clasps tarnished, but it still retained a faint hint of its former elegance. Curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed onto the stage, kneeling in front of the trunk. The lid was slightly ajar, and I carefully lifted it open. Inside, I found old costumes, vibrant once, but now dull with age, hats, capes, masks, and there at the bottom a portrait. It was of the man from the flyer, the amazing Bellini, in all his theatrical glory. But what struck me most was the expression on his face. In the portrait, he wasn't smiling. His eyes were wide, his mouth set in a straight line, like he had been caught in a moment of fear or shock. I stared at the painting for a long time, trying to reconcile the image on the flyer with the one in the trunk. Something had clearly gone wrong here. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I stood up. The theater seemed quieter now, the distant creaks and groans of the old building fading into an eerie stillness. I looked around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but the place was empty. Just me and the forgotten relics of a time long past. As I turned to leave the stage, I noticed something strange. A poster hanging on the wall near the back of the stage, one I hadn't seen when I first came in. It was just like the flyer I'd found, only this one was newer, the colors brighter, the edges less worn. But the most unsettling part was the date at the bottom, tonight. I froze, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of it. There was no way that could be right. This place had been abandoned for years. There hadn't been a performance here in decades, let alone one scheduled for tonight. And yet, there it was, clear as day, as if the theater had never closed its doors. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound of footsteps echoing through the empty auditorium. I spun around, scanning the room, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, growing louder, closer. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, but I couldn't see anything. I backed away, my eyes darting toward the exits. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, but not by something visible. It was more like the theater itself was aware of my presence, and it didn't like it. The creaking of the floorboards, the faint rustle of old fabric, the shifting shadows, all of it felt wrong, unnatural, like the theater had been waiting for someone, for me. And then I saw it. Standing in the center of the stage, where the trunk had been just moments ago, was a figure. Dressed in a faded costume, his face painted in a grim mask of white and black. The amazing Bellini stood motionless, his arms outstretched, just as they were in the flyer. He wasn't quite real. His form flickered in and out of focus, as though he were caught between being there and not being there at the same time. But his presence was undeniable. His eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to fix on me, even though his expression never changed. He was frozen in time, forgotten, but somehow still here, performing for an audience that no longer existed. The lights in the theater flickered, dim and erratic, casting long shadows that danced across the decaying walls. I could feel the weight of Bellini's stare, as if he was waiting for me to do something, to take my place in whatever twisted act this was. But I couldn't move, couldn't think. The sense of wrongness overwhelmed me, pinning me in place. The footsteps returned, louder this time, echoing through the empty hall. But they weren't random anymore. They were coming toward me, fast. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but as I reached the edge of the stage, I looked back one last time. Bellini was gone. The stage was empty, the trunk closed, the poster vanished from the wall. It was as though the theater had swallowed him whole, erasing all evidence that he had ever been there. But I knew what I had seen, and somehow I knew that I wasn't supposed to leave. I stumbled out of the theater, gasping for breath as I hit the fresh air outside. The town was just as it had always been, quiet, unassuming, unaware of the secrets hidden in that old building. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Bellini wasn't finished. He had been waiting for something, or someone, and now that someone knew he was still there. I had lived in the same small town my entire life, a quiet place where nothing much ever happened. People worked their 9-to-5 jobs, kids played in the streets until dusk, and weekends were spent at the local diner or catching a movie at the old theater downtown. It wasn't exactly exciting, but it was comfortable, predictable. It started a few months back. I'd hear people talking in hushed tones at the grocery store or catch snippets of conversations at the gas station. "Did you see them last night?" Someone would whisper, and there'd be a nervous laugh, but no one would say anything more. I didn't pay much attention to it until one night, when I had to work late. I was coming home after midnight, tired and ready to collapse. The streets were empty, most houses dark with only the occasional porch light flickering. I was just a few blocks from home when I saw something strange, a figure standing under a street lamp in the distance. At first, I thought it was a person, just someone out late. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a clown. Not the kind you'd see at a birthday party or even at a circus. This one was tall, too tall, wearing an old-fashioned clown suit, its colors faded and stained. Its face was pale, the makeup exaggerated, with large eyes that seemed to follow me even from a distance. I stopped for a moment, staring, wondering if I was imagining it. But it was real. It just stood there, perfectly still, under the dim light of the street lamp. Something about it didn't feel right, so I hurried home, not looking back. That night I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown, standing there, watching. When morning came, I convinced myself that it was probably just some prank, a bunch of kids messing around. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. A few nights later, I saw another one. This time it was across the street from my house. I was taking out the trash when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Standing in the shadows near the old oak tree was another clown. This one was different, shorter, but wearing a similar faded outfit. Its face paint was more elaborate, the mouth painted in a permanent smile that felt too wide, too forced. It didn't move, didn't react to me at all. Just stood there, staring. I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. I peeked through the window, expecting it to still be there. But it was gone. My heart was racing, and my mind was trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I hadn't heard anything about a circus in town, no traveling performers or festivals that would explain why clowns were suddenly appearing late at night, and no one seemed to be talking about it openly. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing them more often. They were always out late, never during the day, and they were always just standing there. Sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, always in the most unexpected places, under street lamps, near the edges of parking lots, even in people's backyards. I never saw them move, never saw them interact with anyone, but I knew others were seeing them too. People stopped going out at night. The streets were deserted after dark, as if everyone knew something was wrong, but didn't want to admit it. There was a night when I couldn't sleep. The eerie feeling had been building for days, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. I sat up in bed and glanced out my bedroom window. My heart sank. Across the street, standing directly under the same street lamp where I'd seen the first clown, was a group of them, 3, maybe 4. Their brightly painted faces were turned toward my house, their eyes fixed on my window. I watched them for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. They didn't move, they didn't make a sound, just stood there, waiting. Eventually, I forced myself to look away, hoping they'd be gone by morning. But they weren't. The next day, I found faded footprints on the sidewalk near my house, in the exact spot where the clowns had stood. I wanted to believe it was just some leftover chalk dust from kids playing, but the shapes were unmistakable, huge round prints like oversized clown shoes. I started asking around cautiously at first. Most people gave vague answers or brushed off my questions, but eventually I found someone willing to talk. An old man who had lived in the town for decades, longer than anyone else. He told me that this wasn't the first time the clowns had appeared. It happened every few years, always at night, always in the same quiet way. The clowns never did anything, at least nothing anyone could remember, but their presence was enough to unsettle the entire town. No one knew where they came from or why they only appeared at night, and no one knew how long they would stay before disappearing again. Some said it had been going on for generations. Others thought it was some sort of curse or bad omen. But there was one thing everyone seemed to agree on. As long as the clowns were around, it was best to stay inside after dark. I didn't need any more convincing. The clowns were becoming more frequent now, showing up on nearly every street at random hours of the night. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of them standing near the playground. Other times they'd be clustered at the edge of the woods. No matter where they were, they never moved, never spoke, and never interacted with the world around them. But they were always watching. The strange part was that no one ever reported them doing anything. They didn't break into houses or cause any damage. They were just there, like silent sentinels that had no purpose other than to observe. But that was enough. People were on edge, avoiding the streets entirely after sunset. Even the bravest among us wouldn't venture outside when the clowns were around. I had started sleeping with my curtains drawn, hoping that if I didn't see them, I could pretend they weren't there. But one night, I made the mistake of peeking outside again. This time, they were standing directly in front of my house. 5 of them, their painted faces turned upward, watching my bedroom window. I backed away from the glass, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, they hadn't moved. They never moved, at least not when anyone was watching. For now, they haven't come any closer, and they haven't done anything. But I can't shake the feeling that they're waiting for something. Maybe they always were. And I can't help but wonder what happens when the clowns stop just standing there. It was one of those late nights where I had no real reason to be out, but the lure of the city had pulled me in. The neon lights, the flickering street lamps, and the hum of activity were comforting in a strange way. I found myself wandering aimlessly through streets I didn't usually visit, my steps following the winding roads of the quieter parts of town. That's when I saw it, a small circus tent, nestled in the corner of a desolate lot. The tent was old, faded, and barely lit, like it had been forgotten. There were no signs of life around it, no crowds, no music, no laughter, just the soft flicker of a few dim bulbs strung up around the entrance. Curiosity gnawed at me, as it always did with strange things like this, and before I knew it, I was stepping through the worn flaps of the tent and into the dim interior. Inside, it was almost too quiet. The faintest sound of creaking ropes and the distant shuffle of something unseen hung in the space. The tent was set up like a tiny circus arena, complete with a center ring and a few tattered seats scattered in a half circle. I expected to find other curious souls, but the place was completely empty. In the middle of the ring stood a clown. He was taller than I'd expected, his frame towering over the ring as if he were stretched too thin. His face was painted in typical clown fashion, pale white, oversized red lips and exaggerated black arches over his eyes. But his clothes were worn, threadbare, like they had been through years of performances, each show wearing away another layer of the fabric. A battered top hat sat crookedly on his head. I stood there just watching him, waiting for him to move, to perform, to do something. But he remained still, staring into the distance. I realized then that there were mirrors lining the inside of the tent, small cracked mirrors hanging from poles, surrounding the ring. Each mirror was dirty, warped, their surfaces dull with age. And then something struck me, something I hadn't noticed at first. The clown had no reflection. I blinked and took a step closer to one of the mirrors, staring into it. My own face looked back at me, distorted slightly by the cracks in the glass. But where the clown should have been, standing right in the center of the ring, there was nothing. Just empty space. I turned back to look at him directly, and there he was, standing motionless, his painted face gazing into nothing. I quickly glanced at the mirrors again, still nothing. The space he occupied seemed completely vacant in every single reflection. A chill crawled up my spine. Something wasn't right. I had seen performers use tricks with mirrors before, but this felt different. There was no angle, no explanation. He was there in front of me, but he simply didn't exist in any of the reflections around us. I walked to another mirror, then another, my eyes darting between the glass and the clown, my pulse quickening with each confirmation. The mirrors all showed the same thing, an empty ring, a vacant tent, but no clown. I didn't know what to make of it, but the longer I stayed, the more unsettled I became. It was like the tent itself was trying to erase him, to pretend he wasn't really there. The weight of the quiet pressed in on me as I circled the ring, glancing at each mirror, feeling the absence of his reflection more keenly with each step. I thought about leaving then, but something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was something I hadn't seen yet. As I moved closer to the edge of the ring, I noticed something strange in the floor's surface. It was covered in dust, thick and undisturbed, except for the path I had walked through. The clown's shoes, though, left no marks at all. The floor beneath him was untouched, as if he hadn't been standing there at all. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. He wasn't just missing from the mirrors. He didn't seem to be part of the world around him at all. No footprints, no reflection, no signs of life except for his physical presence, looming over the ring like a ghost no one had invited. The realization gripped me, my heart beating faster as I took a step back. I turned toward the entrance of the tent, ready to leave, but that's when something else caught my eye. In one of the mirrors, just barely visible through the cracks and grime, I saw movement. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I stared at it. It wasn't me, it wasn't my reflection moving. It was the clown. In the mirror, where there had been nothing just moments before, I saw him. Not standing, not still like he was in reality, but moving, his head turning ever so slightly toward me. His painted eyes in the mirror were fixed on me, his painted lips curling upward in a slow, unnatural grin that wasn't reflected in his real face. I stumbled back, my eyes darting between the mirror and the actual clown standing in the ring. In the physical world, he was still frozen in place, staring blankly ahead, his expression unchanged. But in the mirror, he moved, slowly, methodically, his gaze following me. His movements in the reflection didn't match anything happening in real life. I looked around, feeling trapped between the real and the reflected. The mirrors that had shown him as absent moments ago were now showing him watching me, grinning at me like he had been waiting for me to notice. My skin crawled as I realized I wasn't seeing a reflection at all. I was seeing something else. Something behind the glass. Something more real than what stood in front of me. I had to leave. I backed away from the mirrors, trying not to look at them, not wanting to see him moving in those cracked surfaces. The exit was close, the flaps of the tent barely swaying in the gentle night breeze. But as I reached the edge of the tent, I couldn't resist one last glance over my shoulder. I had to know if he was still there. He was. The real clown, standing perfectly still in the middle of the ring, hadn't moved an inch. But in the mirrors, every one of his reflections stood right behind me, their grinning faces staring straight at me, too close for comfort. I turned and ran, bursting out of the tent and into the open night air. The carnival was quiet, eerily so. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was following me or if those mirrored versions of him had found their way out of the glass. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his painted face, and worse, the version of him in the mirror, moving where he shouldn't have been. I avoided mirrors for days after that, but no matter what, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in some reflection, he was watching me, grinning, waiting. It wasn't until I passed by a storefront window late one evening that I saw him again. There, in the reflection of the glass, I saw him standing behind me. It was a summer carnival, the kind that sets up overnight in an empty parking lot and vanishes just as quickly when it's over. Rides popped up, booths lined the makeshift paths, and bright lights illuminated the place, casting a neon glow across the town. It seemed like everyone was there. Families, groups of teenagers, and wandering couples. I hadn't planned on going, but something about the way the carnival appeared so suddenly caught my attention. I decided to stop by for an hour or two. Walking through the carnival, everything felt strangely artificial. The lights were too bright, the music was oddly muffled, and the laughter of the crowd seemed to hang in the background without ever becoming distinct. I wandered from one game to the next, never staying long, just observing the scene around me. After a while, I stumbled across the funhouse, tucked away near the edge of the carnival, its entrance marked by garish lights and an oversized clown face with its mouth wide open. I stood there for a moment, staring at the entrance. There was something about the place that unsettled me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. The funhouse seemed out of place, older than the rest of the carnival, like it had been around much longer than anything else. But curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I was stepping through the mouth of the giant clown and into the dimly lit interior. The first room was typical enough, mirrors everywhere, distorted reflections stretching and shrinking me as I walked past them. I could hear faint laughter and the distant sound of mechanical music, but everything was muted, as though the walls of the fun house absorbed the outside world. The mirrors cast strange shadows, making it hard to tell where the real walls were and where the reflections began. As I moved deeper into the funhouse, the air grew cooler and the lighting dimmer, the noise of the carnival fading away entirely. I turned a corner and came face to face with a masked figure. For a moment I froze, thinking it was a person standing in front of me. The mask was a pale, featureless face, smooth and white, with only small black slits for eyes. It was unsettling in its simplicity, but as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, posed in the corner of the hallway, its head tilted slightly downward. There was something unnerving about it, though I couldn't explain why. I moved past it and into the next room, where more mannequins stood, all wearing similar white masks. They were arranged in bizarre poses, some twisted and hunched, others standing tall with their heads cocked at odd angles. The masks on their faces were identical, completely smooth and blank, yet each figure seemed to carry a different expression, a different kind of tension, as if they were frozen in mid-action. I felt like they were watching me even though they had no eyes. As I made my way deeper into the funhouse, the rooms became stranger. The mannequins multiplied, filling the spaces in odd clusters, blocking certain paths. Each time I turned a corner, there seemed to be more of them, closer, their blank faces reflecting the dim light in unsettling ways. It felt like the funhouse was shrinking around me, the walls pressing in, the mannequins blocking my way forward. I turned to retrace my steps, but the path back seemed different, the mirrors shifting my perspective in disorienting ways. Then, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In one of the reflections, the masked figure wasn't standing where it should have been. The mirror at the end of the hallway showed one of the mannequins, but in the wrong place, closer to me than it had been. I turned around sharply, but nothing had changed in the hallway. The mannequins stood where they were before, still frozen in their unsettling poses. I tried to shake off the feeling and moved on, but my heart was racing now. The deeper I went, the more things seemed off. The layout of the funhouse was no longer making sense. I could have sworn I had already passed through certain rooms, yet here they were again, identical mannequins in the same eerie poses. The repetition of the masked figures made it hard to tell if I was walking in circles or if the funhouse was shifting around me. That's when I noticed something else. In the dim light, one of the masked figures seemed slightly different. Its posture was less rigid, its stance more natural. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to figure out what was bothering me. And then it hit me. Its mask was different too. It wasn't quite as smooth, as though something was beneath it, pressing outward ever so slightly. My unease grew, and I made up my mind to leave. I turned and headed toward the entrance, but every hallway looked the same. The mannequins seemed to have multiplied, more of them standing in the corridors, watching me with their blank, expressionless faces. The silence around me grew oppressive, each step echoing faintly as I moved through the endless maze of mirrors and figures. I turned another corner, and that's when I saw it. The masked figure standing directly in front of me, blocking the hallway. This one wasn't frozen like the others. It stood there, still but not in the same way. The mask on its face was different again, warped slightly as if something beneath it was trying to escape. I stood there, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. It took a step forward. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears, trying to keep my distance. I turned, hoping to find another path, but the hallway behind me was blocked by more mannequins. Their masks glistened faintly in the dim light, and for the first time I could sense that they were watching me. The masked figure in front of me stepped closer, its blank face staring straight ahead, though I felt like it was looking right through me. The mask seemed to shift, its surface rippling as though whatever was underneath was pushing against it. I turned and ran. The funhouse corridors twisted around me, each corner revealing more mannequins, more blank, expressionless faces. I ran blindly, not caring where I was going, just trying to get away. The hallways felt endless, each one blending into the next, and I could hear faint footsteps behind me, the sound echoing through the halls. Finally, I saw it. The exit, the faint light from outside filtering in through the open doorway. I sprinted toward it, heart pounding, as the feeling of being watched intensified with each step. Just as I reached the exit, I risked a glance back. Standing at the end of the hallway was the masked figure, its face now fully distorted, the mask bulging outward as though something was pressing from the inside. I could only catch a glimpse of it before I stumbled out into the open air of the carnival. I didn't stop running until I was far from the funhouse, far from the carnival. I don't know what was behind the mask, and I'm not sure I want to know. But ever since that night, I can't shake the feeling that something has followed me. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of white out of the corner of my eye, just a flash like the edge of a blank mask disappearing around a corner. I haven't been back to that carnival. In fact, I've avoided anything like it since then. But sometimes, when I pass by a reflection, I swear I see that mask. Watching. Waiting. It started with a simple street performance. I remember seeing him for the first time outside the subway station, standing still amid the rush of people, a clown in full makeup and costume. His white face was painted with exaggerated features, large, dark eyes, a wide red smile that stretched unnaturally across his face, and a bright orange wig that clashed with the muted colors of the city around him. He stood in silence, holding a balloon in one hand, his other hand motionless by his side. He never asked for money, never waved or beckoned to the crowd, and unlike other performers who tried to engage with passers-by, he remained rooted in place, watching the world pass him by. At first I thought it was just another gimmick, a mime act perhaps, or someone testing how long they could stay frozen in one spot. But as the days passed, I noticed something strange. He was always there. It didn't matter what time of day or night I passed by, early mornings on my way to work, late evenings when the streets were mostly empty. He stood in the exact same spot, never shifting, never acknowledging the people around him. His silence was unnerving. I began to wonder if anyone else had noticed him, but no one seemed to pay him any attention. The crowds flowed around him like water around a stone, and even when children passed by, laughing or pointing, he never moved. His eyes remained fixed on something distant, something none of us could see. One evening, after a long day at work, I lingered near the subway entrance, watching him. The usual bustle of commuters had died down, leaving only a few stragglers making their way home. I don't know why I stayed, but there was something about him that I couldn't shake. His stillness seemed unnatural, as though he were waiting for something. I stood at a distance, watching as people passed him without a second glance. That's when I noticed it. His balloon, bright red and bobbing gently in the faint breeze, wasn't tied to anything. It wasn't attached to his hand or a string. It simply hovered near him, staying close, but never drifting away. At first I thought I was imagining it, but the more I watched, the clearer it became. The balloon wasn't floating naturally. It was anchored to him somehow, but not in any way I could understand. I shook it off as some kind of trick. Maybe it was attached with an invisible thread or some clever magician's prop. Still, the whole scene left me feeling unsettled, and I quickly made my way home. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't get the image of the clown out of my head, his face painted into a grotesque smile, his eyes vacant, and that balloon, hovering too close, too still. Over the next few days, I couldn't resist checking on him again. I'd pass by the subway entrance on my way to work, glance over to where he stood, and see the same thing every time. The clown, the balloon, and the unbroken silence. It became almost routine. But then I started to notice small changes, things that made my skin prickle with unease. His position shifted, not dramatically, just a subtle difference each time I passed by. One day his head tilted slightly to the side. The next day his hand had moved an inch or so from where it had been before. These weren't the normal, fluid gestures of a performer trying to engage an audience. They were slow, creeping changes that seemed to happen only when no one was watching. I couldn't tell when or how it was happening, but I knew that he wasn't completely still. I knew that something was wrong. I tried talking to a few people about him, but no one seemed to care. He was just another street performer, they said, nothing unusual, but the more I watched, the more I became convinced that he was something else. One day, after nearly a week of obsessing over the silent clown, I decided to approach him. The subway entrance was quieter than usual, and I found myself standing just a few feet away from him, staring up into his painted face. His eyes were open, but there was no life behind them, no sign that he even registered my presence. The balloon hovered beside him as it always did, swaying gently even though the wind had died down. I couldn't explain what drew me to him, but there was something compelling about his silence, like an unfinished sentence hanging in the air, waiting to be completed. I reached out toward the balloon, intending to touch it, to see if it was real. But before my fingers could make contact, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. My hand froze midair, inches away from the balloon, and I pulled back instinctively, as if touching it would break something fragile, something that should never be disturbed. That night, I dreamed of him. In the dream, the clown was standing in my bedroom, perfectly still as always, his painted face illuminated by the dim light from my window. The balloon floated beside him, casting an unnatural shadow on the wall. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the oppressive silence that surrounded him in the dream was suffocating. I woke up drenched in sweat, The image of his face burned into my mind. I tried to avoid the subway station after that. I started taking longer routes to work, anything to avoid passing by him. But the dreams didn't stop. Every night I saw him, closer each time, standing at the foot of my bed, standing in the corner of the room, always watching. The balloon hovered near him, and in each dream it seemed to glow faintly, like it held something inside it, something I wasn't meant to see. One evening, as I walked home on a path that bypassed the subway, I glanced down a side street and saw him standing there. He wasn't at his usual spot anymore. He was following me. That night, the dreams were worse. He was in my room again, his painted smile wider than before, the balloon now pressing against the ceiling, stretching it in ways that defied physics. I woke up in a panic, convinced that if I didn't do something, the clown would find a way out of my dreams and into the waking world. The next day, I made my way back to the subway station, determined to confront him. I don't know what I expected, to catch him in the act maybe, or to prove to myself that it was all in my head. But when I arrived, he wasn't there. The spot where he had stood every day for weeks was empty. The balloon, the painted smile, the unblinking eyes, all gone. Relief washed over me at first, but then I noticed something else. Where the clown had once stood, there was now a single red balloon tied to the railing. It swayed gently in the breeze, its string taut, as though it had been left there for me. I stared at it for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest, before turning and walking away. I haven't seen him since that day. The balloon was gone by the next morning, and no one seemed to remember the clown who had haunted that subway entrance for so long. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel like he's watching me. When I pass by empty streets or glance into the shadows, I catch glimpses of orange hair or a flash of white makeup. And though he's never appeared in my dreams again, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, just out of sight, he's waiting. I first heard about the circus from an old neighbor. He was one of those people you see every day but never talk to, always sitting on his porch with a cigarette hanging from his lips. One evening, as I walked past, he leaned over the railing and told me to keep an eye out for the circus that was coming to town. I didn't think much of it at the time. Another traveling show, nothing unusual, but his tone stuck with me, like he was giving a warning rather than a suggestion. A few days later, the posters started appearing around town. They looked old, weathered, as if they had been sitting in storage for years. The colors were faded, the paper brittle, yet the bold letters still proclaimed, "The greatest show on earth," with a list of acts that seemed straight out of another century. There were illustrations of acrobats, animals, and of course, clowns. What struck me was that no one seemed to know who had put the posters up. There were no trucks, no advertisements, just these posters that seemed to appear overnight. The location of the circus was at the edge of town, in an abandoned lot that had been empty for as long as I could remember. By the time I decided to go see it for myself, a large tent had already been erected. It was massive, far too large for the small space it occupied, with its faded stripes of red and white billowing faintly in the breeze. A few trailers were scattered around the perimeter, and flickering bulbs lit the entrance, though they barely held their light, giving the whole scene a dim, washed-out look. What struck me first was the quiet. A circus should be filled with noise, barkers shouting, children laughing, the hum of excitement. But this one felt different. There was no music, no chatter, just the occasional rustle of the tent fabric and the sound of footsteps from those entering. I followed the small crowd, a few families and curious stragglers, into the tent, where the seats were arranged in a perfect circle around the center ring. It felt cramped, though there were plenty of empty seats. Everything inside looked worn, the chairs sagging, the spotlight dim, yet the tent was filled with an almost tangible tension, as if we were about to witness something we weren't meant to see. The show began without fanfare, no grand announcement, no booming voice to welcome us. The lights dimmed, and the first performer, a juggler, stepped into the center ring. His face was obscured by shadow, but the glow of the spotlight caught the glitter of his spinning objects, knives and clubs flying in precise arcs. He moved gracefully, but something about his performance felt off. The way the knives glinted in the light, the way they seemed too close to the audience, as if the danger wasn't entirely under control. A few people clapped softly, but most watched in uneasy silence. Next came the acrobats, a trio of them. They swung from ropes that looked like they should have snapped under their weight, twisting and spinning high above the audience. The performers were lithe, their costumes frayed at the edges, the sequins dull and tarnished. They performed flawlessly, but at the height of their swings was unnerving. There were no safety nets, nothing to catch them if they fell. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the inevitable slip, but they never faltered. Their performance was precise, almost mechanical, and when they finished, they simply melted into the shadows, leaving the ring empty once more. I began to notice something strange as the show went on. The performers, the clowns, the jugglers, the acrobats, never left through the main entrance of the ring. They would finish their act, then vanish into the darkness of the tent's interior, their faces never fully visible. It was as though they were slipping into some unseen pocket of the circus, disappearing as soon as their part was done. And despite the growing unease in the crowd, no one seemed willing to leave. We all sat there, captivated by the bizarre performance unfolding before us, as if compelled by something beyond our control. As the show continued, a sense of distortion set in. The acts seemed to blend together, each one more surreal than the last. A contortionist twisted into impossible shapes, her limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been natural. Her face remained expressionless, her eyes dull and glazed over as she moved through her routine. The clowns, who had started the show with harmless antics, grew unsettling in their persistence. Their faces were frozen in exaggerated grins, but there was something hollow behind their painted expressions. They moved between the audience and the stage as though they belonged to neither, their presence more of an intrusion than entertainment. I lost track of time. The night dragged on, and the show never seemed to end. The performers cycled in and out of the ring, but each act bled into the next, an endless loop of unsettling displays. The audience, too, seemed to have changed. People who had been sitting beside me earlier were now gone, their seats empty. No one had left through the main exit, but the crowd was thinning. The more I looked, the more I realized that the faces in the tent seemed unfamiliar, as if they weren't the same people who had walked in with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was seeing new faces, strangers who had simply appeared out of nowhere, filling the space left by those who had vanished. Eventually, I decided to leave. The unease had become too much, and I couldn't bear to watch any more of the twisted performances. But when I stood to exit, I found the way out obscured. The tent had grown larger, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but the distance to the exit felt impossibly far. The rows of seats seemed to stretch endlessly, and no matter how far I walked, the flap that should have led outside was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. The other audience members, if you could still call them that, didn't seem to notice my struggle. They sat silently, staring ahead at the empty ring, their faces expressionless. I wasn't sure if they were even aware of the performance anymore. It felt like I was watching something I shouldn't have seen, something that wasn't meant for anyone to witness. I don't know how I got out. At some point, everything blurred, and I found myself standing outside the tent, the cold night air washing over me. The circus was gone. The massive tent that had towered above the lot was no longer there. The trailers had disappeared, and the empty lot was nothing but overgrown grass. It was as if the entire thing had been a mirage, a trick of the mind. But I knew it had been real. I could still feel the sense of dread clinging to me, the distorted images of the performers etched into my memory. In the days that followed, I tried asking around, but no one else seemed to remember the circus. The posters had vanished from the streets, and when I brought it up to others, they just gave me blank stares, as if the whole thing had never existed. Even the lot where the tent had stood was undisturbed, no sign that anything had been there. But sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of something out of the corner of my eye. A faded poster on a street lamp, fluttering in the wind. A flash of red and white stripes in the distance, disappearing before I can get a good look. I've stopped asking about the circus now. I don't want to know when it'll come back, or who it'll take with it the next time it visits. It started off as something I barely noticed. Just a man in a clown suit standing near the park entrance holding a bunch of balloons. He was there almost every day, his bright outfit and wide, unmoving grin standing out against the backdrop of ordinary people passing by. He'd hand out balloons to kids as they ran by, parents giving polite smiles, and nothing seemed strange about it at first. He wasn't like the other street performers or clowns I'd seen before, though. His outfit never changed, the same faded red and yellow suit with oversized shoes and the same glossy makeup. His balloons were always vibrant, almost unnaturally bright, as if the colors were untouched by the grime and dust of the city. And while he gave them to children, he never moved from his spot. He stood in the same place day after day, watching with that painted grin as kids took the balloons and ran off. At first, I didn't think much of him. Maybe he was just part of the local charm, another quirky figure the city tolerated. But over time I realized that something about him was off. He never interacted with the adults, only the kids. And every time a child took a balloon from his hand, the clown's smile seemed to stretch just a little wider. But even that I might have brushed off as some eccentricity. It wasn't until the disappearances started that I really began to notice the pattern. The first missing child made the news. A boy, barely 7, vanished from the playground one afternoon. His mother had been distracted only for a moment, and by the time she turned around, he was gone. The search went on for days, and as I walked through the park during that time, I saw the balloon vendor still standing there, still handing out his brightly colored balloons as if nothing had happened. A week later, another child disappeared. This time, a little girl, not much older than the boy. She had been walking home from school when she vanished without a trace. The city was in a state of panic by then, but the balloon vendor never changed. I saw him every day, standing in that same spot, his eyes following the children that passed by. He was always still, like a statue that blended into the background of the park. It wasn't until I noticed the balloons that I truly felt the creeping unease. The ones he handed out to the children were the usual mix of colors: blue, yellow, green. But for every child that went missing, a single red balloon would appear, floating high above the park. These red balloons weren't tied to anything, just suspended in the air, always hovering just out of reach. No one else seemed to notice them, but once I started looking, I couldn't stop. After each disappearance, without fail, another red balloon would join the others, bobbing silently against the backdrop of the sky. I watched him more closely after that. He still never left his post, and I began to wonder if he ever left at all. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw him pack up or move from that spot. Each time I passed through the park, he was there, always with the same set of balloons, the same unnerving stillness, and that same plastic smile. The only thing that changed was the growing number of red balloons. At night, when the park was deserted, I would walk by just to see if he was still there. He was, always standing in that same spot, bathed in the dim light of the street lamps. It became clear that he wasn't just some ordinary balloon vendor. There was something else at play, something that no one seemed to see except me. One evening, I made the mistake of staying too long, watching him as the park emptied out. The streetlights flickered, and the last few families filtered out of sight. For a moment, the park felt abandoned. I stood behind a tree, keeping my distance but still able to see him. His back was to me, facing the playground, and his hand still gripped the strings of his balloons. Then I noticed it. One of the strings was missing. A balloon that had been part of the bunch was now gone, floating lazily upward to join the cluster of red balloons above. It had been green, one of the ones he had been handing out to kids earlier that day. As I watched it drift higher, I realized that no child had taken it. The vendor hadn't moved an inch. The balloon had simply left, as if it had a mind of its own. The realization struck me hard. The number of red balloons was not a coincidence. Each one was tied to a missing child, and they weren't floating by accident. The balloons were markers, silent, floating reminders of those who had disappeared. But why did no one else seem to notice? I began asking around, trying to find out who this man was. None of the regulars at the park knew. The vendors who sold ice cream or worked the playground had no memory of when he first showed up. Even the park security had no idea how long he had been there. No one could remember a time without him, but no one could pinpoint where he came from either. The last time I saw him, the park was nearly empty. Just a few stragglers left. I was watching from a distance, trying to figure out if I could approach him, maybe ask him something, or figure out why he was always there. But before I could make my move, a small child wandered up to him alone, holding their parent's hand. The vendor bent slightly at the waist, his arm extending toward the child with a balloon in hand. But this time, the balloon wasn't blue or green or yellow, it was red. The parent, distracted by something on their phone, didn't even look up as the child reached for the string. And as the balloon exchanged hands, the vendor's grin grew, impossibly wide, and the child's face, once lit with excitement, went slack. I turned away before I could see what happened next. I couldn't stay there anymore. The next day, the news reported another missing child. And sure enough, when I passed by the park, there was another red balloon floating high above, joining the others. I avoid the park now, but sometimes, when the wind shifts, I swear I can still catch a glimpse of that red suit through the trees. And when I look up, those balloons are always there, silent, floating, watching. It was a gray afternoon when I stumbled across the flyer. It had been tucked under a windshield wiper of my car, bright yellow with bold black letters, Circus of Smiles and Unforgettable Experience. The details were vague, but the show times listed for that night intrigued me. I hadn't seen a circus in years, and something about the anonymity of it, a pop-up with no promotion other than this single sheet of paper, piqued my curiosity. That evening I drove out to the outskirts of town. The circus tent loomed at the edge of a wide field, isolated and dimly lit by a few spotlights. The tent itself was faded, once brightly colored, but now dulled by years of neglect. A few people trickled inside, but for the most part the place was unusually quiet. No music, no bustling crowd, just the soft murmur of those arriving. It gave the place an odd, almost deserted feeling. I made my way inside, sitting in the front row. The seats around me began filling up, though there were never quite enough people to match the size of the tent. In the center, the performance ring stood empty, a solitary spotlight casting a cold, sterile light. A sense of anticipation built, and after what felt like too long, the lights dimmed and the clowns appeared. The first clown came out, his entrance accompanied by faint carnival music that felt tinny and distant, like it was being played on an old broken-down radio. His costume was ragged, mismatched, and the makeup on his face seemed exaggerated, almost grotesque. He performed the typical routine: oversized shoes, exaggerated stumbling, a plastic flower squirting water. The audience laughed softly at first, but something about the act felt off, like he was going through the motions without any real enthusiasm. Another clown followed, then another. Each one looked stranger than the last, their makeup smudged, their costumes worn thin. They performed in silence, relying on exaggerated gestures to communicate. The first time I noticed it, I brushed it off. But by the fourth or fifth clown, I realized it wasn't part of the show. None of them were leaving. They would finish their bit, pause for a beat, and then freeze in place. Each clown remained in the center ring, statuesque and unmoving, their blank expressions lingering longer than they should. The atmosphere shifted. Laughter from the audience grew more sporadic, then ceased altogether. People were looking around now, murmuring to each other, confusion spreading through the crowd. The tent felt smaller, more enclosed, the number of clowns growing as more and more joined the stage, each one locking into their final pose. No one had exited. They just stood there, accumulating like forgotten mannequins. I looked behind me, expecting to see the entrance flap where I'd come in, but there was nothing, just the taut fabric of the tent. The rows of seats, once sparse, seemed fuller now, though I couldn't recall seeing more people arrive. Faces around me were tight with discomfort, eyes darting around as if waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. The show should have ended by now, but it continued with no clear direction. As the minutes stretched on, the number of clowns in the ring grew to an unsettling number. Their frozen stances began to take on a sense of uniformity, each one staring into the crowd without blinking, without breaking form. There was no clear point to their presence anymore. They weren't performing, they were just there, standing, waiting. A prickling sensation spread across my skin, and I became acutely aware of the silence. The music had long since faded away, and the only sound was the occasional shuffle of people shifting in their seats. Uneasy. I wasn't the only one scanning the perimeter now. Others were too, searching for exits, for some sign that the show was over. But the clowns remained. The tent, once filled with the smell of popcorn and cotton candy, now had a sterile, stale scent, as if it had been left unattended for too long. The clowns, with their painted faces and stiff postures, appeared more like hollow shells, drained of any humor or joy they were meant to bring. Each one was positioned just a little closer to the audience than before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow they were watching us. Time lost meaning. I couldn't say how long I'd been sitting there, but the unease was spreading. People shifted nervously in their seats, some whispering to one another, others staring blankly ahead, unsure of what to do. The rows behind me began to empty. Not from people getting up and leaving, though, just fewer and fewer bodies as I glanced back until I couldn't tell if I was remembering wrong or if there really had been more of us. I tried to stand, but my legs felt heavy, not physically trapped, but rooted in place by an inexplicable reluctance. The clowns, once scattered in the ring, were now forming a tighter circle, their eyes locked on us. The first few rows of the audience, where I sat, felt uncomfortably close to the edge of that circle. The clowns seemed to be inching toward us, imperceptibly, but definitely moving closer. I finally made a move to leave. I scanned the tent again, desperate to find the exit, but it had vanished completely. The flap I'd come through was gone. The space behind me, nothing but endless rows of seats and the towering tent walls. The only way out seemed to be through the center, past the clowns, but no one else was moving. No one dared approach the ring. The tension reached a breaking point. The clowns, still frozen, had somehow closed the distance between themselves and the front row. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on me, and it became clear that this wasn't a performance anymore. Whatever this was, it wasn't meant to entertain. The laughter, the joy, the circus itself had dissolved into something else entirely. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember how I got out, or even if anyone else did. But when I woke up the next morning, the tent was gone. The field where it had stood was empty, no sign of anything having been there. No torn posters, no trampled grass, nothing. I haven't been able to shake the feeling since. Like they're still watching, waiting. I avoid circuses now, of course, but sometimes I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Bright colors, a flash of painted white, a red nose, always lingering just out of reach.